So let's move on to the last set of slides before the break. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to actually do experiments, sort of different ways to think about approaches to experiments. So we've talked a lot about working with companies. One of the questions that sometimes people ask me is like, well, I don't work at Facebook. I can't run an online experiment. And I think that's just not right. So I think, in fact, there are people in this room who have shown that you can very creatively run online experiments without the cooperation of the large tech companies. So I want to talk about a couple different ways you can think about doing experiments and what are the trade-offs between these different approaches. So I think the main dimensions of the trade-offs are cost, control being the experimental control that you have, realism, and ethics. And so I think basically one strategy is what I called partner with the powerful. So this would be working with companies or governments. So the things that Beth Novick talked about, for example, this often has a low cost to you because the company has already built all the infrastructure that they need to do these. You sometimes have a decent amount of control over the treatment. Other times you can't. So there are certain treatments that Facebook has the capability of running, but would never let you. The realism is high, and then the ethics are potentially complicated. How should you partner with the powerful? So first, you have to think of it as a partnership. So I've heard people come to me and say, oh, I want the New York Times to give me all of their data. And I'm like, well, I can tell you that's not going to happen. Like, if you say, I want to partner with the New York Times to work on a project together, that's a very different way to begin a conversation. So if you begin with, give me your data, that's not likely to be successful. If you begin with, I want to run my experiment, not likely to be successful. So think about how you can partner. There are a lot of personal relationships involved. So Alondra Nelson talked about how we can make access to data more democratic and open to everyone. I think in terms of partnering with people at companies, it's hard for me, for experiments, it's hard for me to imagine a mechanism like Social Science 1 where everyone can apply and so on. I think there's a lot of trust involved and building personal relationships through things like internships or meeting people at conferences. I don't have any great advice for how to do this. The best, I guess the most concrete thing I could say is do internships. So most of these companies have internship programs. They want to hire people just like you. And so doing an internship is a great way to learn. You'll get exposed to lots of new stuff. It's a great learning experience. You'll pick up skills that you don't pick up in your university. And it's a great way to form partnerships where you could do research both while you're an intern and potentially afterwards. And then last thing I want to talk about is Pastore's Quadrant. This is also came up in Beth's talk. So at a company, most of what they're going to do, so let's go back for 1 second. So people sometimes think there's a distinction between pure research and applied research. And a great counterexample to this one-dimensional thinking is Pasteur. So his work that led to the germ theory of disease, which is naturally as pure research as you could imagine, was motivated in part by his work trying to convert beet juice into alcohol at a factory. And the stuff kept blowing up in the factory. And he said, I wonder why this reaction is not working well. There must be some other thing here that I'm not able to see with my eyes that's causing this. So that was both motivated by use, so turning beet juice into alcohol, and seeking fundamental understanding. And so those are the kinds of projects that I think are best for partnering with the powerful. There has to be a consideration of use. If you go to a company and say, I want to do this cool thing to study this mechanism that psychologists are really interested in, it's just, I don't think that's likely to be very effective. But if you say, I want to help you achieve your goals, and simultaneously, we're going to be able to advance science, they'll generally, I think, be much more open. But you don't have to partner with the powerful. You can just do it yourself. So One is use existing systems, so the cost is often low. The control is low because you have to sort of hijack what these systems allow. The realism can be high and the ethics can be complex. So the experiment that we saw with Wikipedia, they just used existing things on Wikipedia, and that allowed them to run these experiments. Kevin has done some stuff on Twitter where he took advantage of the capabilities that Twitter had to just sort of run an experiment on top of Twitter without the cooperation of people inside of the company. Generally, the types of things you can do are much more narrow if you're not behind the scenes moving things around. But I think there's a lot of interesting stuff that can be done in this space. So here's an example that I like. This paper is called The Visible Hand. And so what they did is they measured the effect of race on a bunch of things about selling these iPad minis on Craigslist. So basically, they took advantage of the infrastructure of Craigslist and ran all of these ads and tried to measure the effect of the race of the seller or whether the seller had a tattoo or not. Did not require any cooperation with Craigslist. So again, I think there's lots of opportunities to use digital platforms without having to work with them directly. You could build your own experiment. The cost here is medium. The control is high because you're building it yourself. The realism can be medium and the ethics are relatively easy. An example of this is the Music Lab experiment, which I'll talk to you about after the coffee break. And then the last thing is building a product. So I think this is very, very hard. It's very expensive, but you get a lot of control and a lot of realism. And so the example here is Movie Lens. They built a service to do movie recommendations, and this is such a good service that people use it. And so it is essentially a product. It is competing against other products, but it enables research. So I want to say this idea of building a product that then becomes a platform for your research, you can imagine this kind of cycle like I talked about with all their ideas. So this, if you can do this, this is magical, right? You don't need to push the boulder up the hill over and over and over again. You've pushed the boulder and each experiment gets easier and easier and easier because you have a big user base, you have a lot of infrastructure. This is extremely hard. I don't know of many examples where this is successful. And Movie Lens is maybe the only one, and Movie Lens is, I think, struggling now because a lot of recommendations have been taken into other platforms. So that's kind of a range of different approaches. None of these approaches dominate any of the other approaches. There's trade-offs involved in all of them. But I think the most important idea is if you want to partner with the powerful, you need to have a partner. You need to have a reason to be a partner. And then if you want to do it, and the second most important thing is you don't need to partner with the powerful. You can do it yourself using a variety of different strategies. So are there any questions? Nick?
In terms of partnering with the powerful, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about collaborative partnerships versus like transactional partnerships, ones that are ongoing versus just for the duration project, and just kind of the different forms that might take.
Yeah. So I think good partnerships probably take a long time to develop. And also at the beginning, it's often hard to know where they're going to go at the end. So I think like when you're developing a piece of software, there's like this one kind of model called like waterfall where you plan everything out in advance and you say like in week 2, we're going to do this. In week 3, we're going to do this. In week 10, we're going to do this. And then it's fully spec'd out at the beginning. I think that is almost impossible for your partner at the company to be able to do unless you know what their capabilities are really well and they know what your capabilities are really well. So I think much more it's going to be iterative and it's going to be hard to know at the beginning where it's going to go at the end, which I think is why a lot of these things don't work. I will say one piece of advice that I have for you all thinking about doing these partnerships is to remember that you all have a lot to contribute and you all have scarce skills and resources that they need. So I remember when I was in grad school, I met with someone from a company and he like took me out to lunch and I thought that was like the greatest thing. I was like, wow, taking me out to lunch? This is great. And so we talked and he asked me a bunch of questions and I was trying to help. And then he's like, okay, great, let's have lunch again. And he's like, yeah, we'll give you whatever data you need. We'll give you, and they're like, let's have lunch. So we had another lunch and it was like another consulting session. And then I was like, what? He hasn't really given me any data yet. Is he ever gonna give me this data? So I asked around and someone was like, okay, what you should do is say, before our next lunch, please send me a file layout of exactly what is in your database and full technical specifications of what you have. And then once I can see that, then we can have lunch again. And so we never had lunch again. But so one way to, so what I learned from this experience is one, we do have a lot to value. So he was very happy to pay $15 to have an hour of free consulting. And two, you want to try to ask for some sign of commitment at the beginning. And it doesn't have to be big. So if they're not able to do some very basic thing for you, then that's a sign that they're probably not going to be willing or able to do a complicated thing in the future. So sometimes it's hard to tell if they're able to even do what they say or willing. And in some sense it matters, but in some sense it doesn't matter. So I like to now, going forward, ask for like a clear sign of willingness and capability at the beginning. Other questions? All right, so let's have a coffee break. We are only 5 minutes behind schedule, so we're gonna have a 10-minute coffee break. We'll come back here at 10:15 to continue hearing about experiments.